Okay, this on? All right. Everybody ready? So welcome everyone to the first of our Science, Technology, Innovation, and Policy lectures for 2017. Very, very pleased to have with us Tom Mahnken, who is the President and CEO for the Center for Strategic and Budgetary Analysis. Tom is a very, very accomplished public servant, has been in a number of different roles in government as well. Currently, he's serving also as a senior research professor at the Philip Merrill Center for Strategic Studies at the Johns Hopkins University Paul H. Nitze School for Advanced International Studies, or SACE. He served over 20 years in the U.S. Navy Reserve and has served multiple tours in Iraq and Kosovo. His government service includes service as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Policy and Planning from 2006 to 2009, where he helped craft the 2006 Quadrennial Defense Review, or QDR, and a 2008 National Defense Strategy. He served on the staff of the 2014 National Defense Panel, the 2010 Quadrennial Defense Review Independent Panel, and the Commission on the Intelligence Capabilities of the United States regarding Weapons of Mass Destruction. He served in the Defense Department's Office of Net Assessment and as a member of the Gulf War Air Power Survey Study team. So I'm very pleased to welcome Dr. Mahnken.
Great. Thank you very much.
Yep. Thank you for joining us.
My pleasure. Great.
So a little housekeeping. When we get to the Q&A part of the discussion, there's a little vertical sort of rectangular looking button there that'll turn on your microphone, and that way it'll get broadcast out for the WebEx, or I'm sorry, for the streaming. And also, if you do, when you ask questions, please introduce yourself and let the speaker know your affiliation. So welcome, and we look forward to your time,
Great.
Tom.
Thank you so much. Thank you for your hospitality. It's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure to see so many familiar faces here in the audience. And I've kind of struggled a little bit with what to talk about. Not because there aren't plenty of interesting topics to discuss, but really, was trying to really formulate some thoughts I've been having, and also point the way to some work that I'm just kind of launching off on. So my basic argument has to do with both the strategic environment that we face today and are likely to face in the future, but also what that will mean for the national security community, the Defense Department, and the services. And the focus is on great power, competition, and conflict. And my thesis is that we're rapidly entering a period that'll be characterized by great power competition and potentially by great power conflict. However, we're unprepared in many ways for the era that's rapidly approaching us. And so what I want to do is actually, as much as I can, deploy my skills as a historian to try to enlighten where we are today and to speculate on where we need to go in the future. So what I want to do is first to look back and to talk a few minutes about how we got where we are today. And then to sketch out a little bit more fully, well, where we are now. I mean, what the situation is that we face. And then to speculate a little bit about what great power conflict in the 21st century could look like. And then what great power competition, short of war, could look like. And then maybe chart a little bit of the course ahead in terms of topics that we need to give greater attention. How we got where we are today is, in many ways, a good news story, because over the past quarter century, the United States has enjoyed a period of unilateral dominance. And whether we're talking about dominance on the world stage as the only great power, the only superpower, or dominance on the battlefield, where, although we've been challenged in some ways, in other ways we've gone completely unchallenged. That is that has been a very good thing. It's been very beneficial to the United States, and I would argue it's been beneficial to the international system more broadly. But before we talk about how that dominance has been and is being challenged, I think we need to reflect for a little bit on how that dominance came about, because it didn't just spring forth. U.S. dominance over the past quarter century was the product of sound strategy. Geopolitically, it was the product of a sound strategy enacted really first by in the closing years of the Carter administration, but then really fully by the Reagan administration. A strategy aimed at competing with and ultimately defeating the Soviet Union. A strategy that I think began with a very clear-eyed sense both of America's strengths, but also the Soviet Union's considerable weaknesses, and then deployed kind of the full range of the assets of our society in pursuit of that strategy. And going back and looking at the formulation and the implementation of the Reagan administration strategy, one's struck by several things. First, one is struck by the fact that it is possible for a modern liberal democracy to formulate and implement coherent strategy. It's possible. Second, one of the things that strikes you is just how heretical that strategy was at the time it was developed and implemented, and heretical not only to many national security experts, Sovietologists, but even heretical within the Republican Party and heretical within Reagan's own government. Even heretical among the officials that Reagan himself appointed. And the third thing that really strikes one is just that the role of contingency, that in fact that strategy succeeded actually beyond the wildest dreams of most, if not all, of its authors. That even in developing a strategy for competing with the Soviet Union, the vast majority of them didn't think it was going to end with the end of the Cold War and the collapse of the Soviet Union, at least in the time frame that actually occurred. And the military dimension of American dominance really flowed from the strategic dimension as well. The capabilities that we enjoy today sprung from attempts to solve strategic and operational challenges that defied a conventional solution. So the development of precision strike, and here I mean not just weapons, but the sensors, command and control, a whole suite of capabilities, arose from the strategic challenge posed by the Soviet Union and by the Warsaw Pact to NATO in Central Europe, and the political imperative of keeping Western Europe out of Soviet hands. Of course, we've enjoyed those capabilities, and those capabilities have been used in situations far different from those which they were developed for. But they wouldn't have come about, and we wouldn't have them today if it weren't for those challenges and the strategy to meet them. So we enjoyed great success. But I think part of how we got to where we are now is that success bred complacency. And I think if we think about the last 25 years, one can break that period down into two chunks. One is the if you will, the period of the 1990s, which Charles Krauthammer dubbed the unipolar moment, where the United States was essentially unchallenged and at least seemingly invulnerable. During the 1990s, the biggest challenge that we had was that we didn't face big challenges. And so efforts at defense innovation, defense transformation were predicated on opportunity. Right? The whole idea of innovation transformation in the 1990s was to give us the opportunity to do things that we weren't able previously to do. So those of us of a certain age would remember Admiral Bill Owens and the whole idea of dominant battle space knowledge, the idea that you should be able to see and know everything in a 200 by 200 by 200 nautical mile cube. And the argument was, well, that would be great, and I don't dispute that, but in the end it wasn't compelling because it was innovation predicated on opportunity rather than a response to a strategic challenge, as previous waves of innovation had been. So the 1990s, in my view at least, were basically a decade of lost opportunities. And they were lost opportunities, again, for a very good reason, which is that the United States was unchallenged. The last 15 years, we have been challenged, but we've been challenged by a particular type of adversary, a transnational network or series of networks of Islamist terrorists. And we've faced challenges that have required a response, but it's exercised sort of a limited set of our capabilities, a limited set of our muscles, and it's also diverted our attention from other challenges as they were emerging. So if the story of innovation in the first decade after the end of the Cold War was kind of a story of innovation purportedly driven by opportunity, the last 15 years has been innovation and adaptation driven by a very narrow type of adversary. All the while, power was diffusing. China continued its economic rise. Russia dusted itself off after the collapse of the Soviet Union, aided by high oil prices, kind of regathered its strength. And power diffused at the military level as well. So if we just think about precision strike, capabilities that were once very closely held, in many cases just held by the United States, have become increasingly and more broadly available. Whether it's precision weapons, again, more narrowly, or if you think about the sensors, the sensor data, command and control needed to strike with precision, those are now much more broadly held than in the past. Now that diffusion was inevitable. It's in the nature of innovations that they spread. It takes time, they spread unevenly, but they always spread. And now one of the consequences of the spread of innovations is that they change the face of battle. Early on in a cycle of innovation, what you see is the innovator, the country that, or the military that pioneers a new way of war, is able to achieve decisive battlefield outcomes, even if not enduring political ones, but decisive battlefield outcomes. Are often able to win quick, decisive victories. But as those innovations spread, the character of war changes. The battlefield becomes, figuratively at least, much more level. And advantage is much more fleeting, much more transitory, much more situational. So just kind of two historical examples of that as a way of bridging to where we are now and where we're likely to go in the future. Prussia and then Germany pioneered the use of the railroad, the rifle, and the telegraph in the mid-19th century, and was able to use those technologies. Prussia was able to use those technologies to unify the German states under Prussian leadership by defeating first Denmark, then Austria, and then France. Those same tools of war also played an important role in the latter stages of the American Civil War. But when those technologies and the doctrine and organization that went with them spread, like prior to World War I, the result on the battlefield was stalemate, right? All the armies, all the European armies of World War I went into that war in 1914, organized, equipped nearly identically. And the result was stalemate. Or, to take things forward 2 decades from that, Germany pioneered the marrying of tanks, radios, tactical aviation, among other things, to create what others dubbed blitzkrieg, right? And that approach to war, combined arms armored warfare, yielded Nazi Germany a series of quick victories early on in World War II. When tanks spread, when the operational concepts, the organizations that Germany pioneered spread, including to the United States. Just as a side note, if you want to, this is the history nerd in me. I mean, if you want to look at the organization of the first organization of the armored division, when the United States Army stood up its first armored divisions, 1 month to the day after the fall of France, by the way. The organization of those divisions was almost indistinguishable from that of the 1935 organization of the German Panzer Division. And the very first U.S. armor manuals were basically translations of German armored manuals with a little face-saving addition of Sherman tanks instead of Panzers for all the diagrams. So that's a very concrete example of the diffusion of military ideas. When those ideas diffused, and when the United States and the Soviet Union fielded tank armies compared to tank divisions, the character of war changed, and battles at the end of World War II looked very different than the battles at the beginning. So all that's a bridge to say where we are now. We're in a period now where power has diffused and military capabilities are rapidly diffusing. Let me start with the latter first. Precision strike capabilities, which were once very closely held, are now much easier to obtain. And whether it's China's pursuit of conventionally armed precision ballistic missiles, whether it's Russia's investments, or whether it's the missiles, rockets, whatever you want to call it, that have taken U.S. warships under fire in recent days, those capabilities are now much more common. And the diffusion is likely to continue with precision being routinely available at not just longer ranges, but also shorter ranges as well. Precision rockets, artillery, mortars, and so forth. And if history is a guide, that's likely to change the character of war. And I would argue it's likely to change the character of war in a way that's going to make it hard and harder for the U.S. to safeguard its interests. To imagine that, actually, just a couple of counterfactuals from the recent past. Imagine, if you will, go back a decade to the height of the insurgency in Iraq, and imagine what it would have been like living in the Green Zone in 2006 if the insurgents had not just regular unguided mortars, but had guided weapons and could routinely hit that which they could locate either on their iPhones or by actually walking the ground and figuring out the coordinates. That would be a change. Or imagine Afghanistan, the same era or more recently, where the bad guys are able to take under fire the distributed operational posts that we had all across the country. Or imagine being a diplomat in the fixed targets that we call embassies across the world, where those fixed targets can be routinely attacked with great precision. Or imagine being an employee of the International Committee of the Red Cross, where your ICRC facilities can be similarly targeted. So I think where we are now and where we're rapidly going is into a world where it's going to be much easier to strike with precision and much more difficult to project power. And at the same time, the diffusion of power more broadly means that these capabilities will be in the hands not only of Iraqi insurgents and terrorists, but also powerful states. And so we shouldn't be surprised that some of the more powerful states have invested in these capabilities, among others. And why have they done it? Well, in some cases, again, it mirrors our experience with precision early on. China has invested in precision strike capabilities, particularly precision-guided conventional missiles, as a way of solving operational and strategic problems that they face. The need to coerce Taiwan, for example, and hold the United States at arm's length as they do so. They've been busy solving their operational and strategic challenges while we've been doing other things. The challenge the United States faces is the return of great power competition. Even if the Navy Times is right, I guess even if the White House is telling the Defense Department that you're not supposed to use that term, the nice thing is I'm not constrained by that. So you can call it whatever you want, but that's the era that we are living in. And so in some ways, the past can inform us, but in other ways, we face a unique situation, not the least of which because we face not one, but two great power competitors, not of equal weight, not of equal magnitude, not on similar trajectories, but two great power competitors, Russia and China. Both with objectives and interests opposed, although not entirely opposed, but at least in some ways opposed to ours. Both with considerable military capabilities, even if Russia's are waning, even as China's are waxing, and an increasing willingness to deploy those capabilities to back their objectives. So what will or what may great power conflict in the 21st century look like? And I'm deliberately starting with conflict, even though it's still not in an absolute sense very likely, but I think we need to envision what a great power conflict would look like, if only to inform our thoughts about deterrence and to understand what competition short of conflict may look like. So I want to start with the dire, the drastic, great power conflict, and then walk back and talk a little bit about great power competition. Well, again, if history is a guide, a conflict fought by great powers using precision, modern capabilities fought in cyberspace, potentially also in space as well, is likely to be tremendously destructive. It's also likely to be characterized by attrition. It's worth noting that two of America's best armed NATO allies, Britain and France, came very close to exhausting their munition stocks a handful of years ago over Libya. Over Libya. Not over a large conflict in Europe or Asia, over Libya. And so I think, a serious conflict over serious stakes is likely to be marked by high levels of attrition, and you could actually see the belligerents run through their stocks of weapons pretty quickly, as in fact the great powers did on the Western Front in the opening campaigns of World War I. Basically ran through their artillery stocks, and there was a pause while they geared up their industry to rearm. A great power conflict in the 21st century, I think, would also, as a result or related to that, would feature elements of societal mobilization. And at least both for Russia and for China, that already the mobilization, societal mobilization, is already part of their thinking about modern war. And the Russians certainly have given a lot of thought to it, also organizing for it. So have the Chinese. When we talk about national mobilization here, it kind of has a kind of dusty, musty air to it. It's something that we used to do at one time and we don't really think about. Now, of course, mobilization in the 21st century is likely to look a lot different than mobilization, say, in the 20th century. I don't think we'll all be planting victory gardens. I don't think my wife is going to have to paint the back of her legs because she won't have pantyhose because you'll need all the silk to make parachutes. But I do think that the concept of national mobilization is still valid, or will be valid in a new context in the 21st century. Fourth, I think it's likely that great power conflict will involve homeland conflict. Maybe not initially, but probably at some point, whether in the cyber domain or in the in the good old physical domains. We're used to, or in our recent history, we're used to our homeland being considered a sanctuary, or trying to make it one. My late father grew up on Long Island in a period where you could see the burning wrecks of American merchantmen against the night sky every night. The invulnerability of the American homeland cannot be taken for granted. And I think, particularly in a war where conventional capabilities are widely held, the temptation to strike an adversary's homeland is going to be pretty powerful. Now, working against that, but not perhaps decisively against that, is we're not just talking about great power war in the 21st century, but we're talking about great power war in the nuclear era. And now there's a strong belief that we'd never go to war against a nuclear power. That didn't seem to stop Argentina in going to war against Great Britain over the Falklands. Britain's nuclear arsenal didn't seem to deter that. And one can certainly think about circumstances where China or Russia could conceivably go to war against the United States, and that our nuclear arsenal would not deter that. I think there's likely to be almost by definition, there'd be a nuclear dimension to a great power conflict, whether or not nuclear weapons are actually used. So as horrible as it may be to think about, I think we are going to increasingly have to think about what a great power conflict in the 21st century would look like, if only to more effectively be able to deter it. And that takes me to the other area where we need to think more, and that's about great power competition. Again, maybe slightly politically incorrect, but again, I don't have to worry about that. In fact, we've been in the midst of two great power competitions for some years now, whether we acknowledge it or not. In the case of China, I think China's been competing with the United States for a couple decades now. And for Russia, similarly, whether we acknowledge it or not, whether we choose to compete on our side or not, they've been competing with us. And that, great power competition bears some consideration. What are the implications of that? Well, first is I think we need to think seriously about risk in ways that we haven't had to think about risk recently. I think recently, over much of the past 25 years, we've been able to tell ourselves, or maybe we've been able to kid ourselves, that we live in a risk-free world. And the dichotomy is between no risk and unacceptable risk. You hear this posed dichotomously all the time. When the formulation is, when somebody proposes a deterrent action or a coercive action, the formulation is, what do you want? War with fill in the blank. As if the only options were do nothing or war. And in fact, the reality is that there's a whole spectrum between doing nothing and war. And we used to, in the good old days or the bad old days, accept, albeit uncomfortably, lots of risk. Risk posed by deploying large numbers of service members close to the territory of our adversary. Maybe getting a little bit too close to home. My wife was conceived, although not born, along the inter-German border. Why? Because my father-in-law and my mother-in-law were stationed in Hof, Germany, where their job would have been to die if there was at the outset of a NATO-Warsaw Pact war. Now, fortunately, none of that happened. But the point is, we used to accept lots of risk. And with that risk came a demonstration of commitment, how much we cared about our interests, how much we cared about our allies. We've grown unaccustomed to thinking seriously about taking risky actions. And so as a result, every action appears to be kind of overly momentous. I think one of the consequences of re-entering a period of great power competition is we really do need to think very seriously about risk. Second, we also need to think afresh about deterrence. We also need to think more related way. We need to think more seriously about nuclear weapons. Generation has passed since we really seriously thought about deterrence and about nuclear weapons. And that's on our side. Of course, others are thinking very seriously about these things. And if for no other reason that they're thinking very seriously about them, we should probably think about them as well. Another area that I think we need to think very seriously about, that we've grown unused to thinking about, is the whole topic of political influence, or as the Chinese call it, political warfare. In the old days, there were whole parts of the U.S. government that tracked, say, Soviet communist influence in the United States and among allies and in other governments. Today, in both China and Russia, we see attempts to exert political influence. Now, it's not like the Communist Party of the Soviet Union giving satchels of cash to local communist parties, but it's through various means, whether it's RT on the Russian side, whether it's the Confucius Institutes on the Chinese side, whether it's cash payments to various political parties or political candidates. There are efforts by great power competitors to buy political influence, and yet on our side, on the U.S. government side, we've kind of gotten out of the business of thinking about countering foreign political influence. I think we're going to need to pay more attention to that. Another area is we need to think anew about information and about telling our side of the story. You know, there used to be a whole organization, U.S. Information Agency, that was dedicated to getting out the truth about the United States. There are other countries that are competing in that space right now. We're not. I think it's something we need to think very seriously about. And then finally, we need to think very seriously about the defense industrial base. The last quarter century has been, by and large, a story of a shrinking industrial base, an industrial base that is supposed to be as efficient as possible, and that may have been warranted for part of that period. But I think in a period of great power competition, we need to think very seriously about whether efficiency should be the highest goal of our industrial base. Similarly, in an era of globalization, I think we need to think very seriously about what parts of that industrial base should be wholly owned by American companies, and what part can become multinationalized. That's a very serious conversation that needs to go on. It's started to go on in Australia, actually, brought on by a couple of proposed purchases by Chinese companies of Australian infrastructure. I think it needs to go on here as well. So, in conclusion, I think, well, first off, I hope I hope we're in for a much sunnier world than I just painted, but I don't think so, unfortunately. I think we are in for a very challenging period. The good news is that America has met the challenge in the past, but we can't just assume because we've done it in the past that we will in the future. So. We need to get busy. We need to get busy first, doing a better job of studying the past to see where we did well and where we did poorly, and not just we in the United States, but other cases as well. I mean, Great Britain's probably a good example as well. Looking at great power competition, we need to do an audit of where we stand today in terms of the capabilities needed for great power competition. And then we need to, in some cases, exercise muscles that we haven't exercised, that have been allowed to atrophy. In other cases, we may need to build up new capabilities. And we'll probably have to make some tough choices along the way. We'll have to prioritize. But not recognizing it, not focusing on it, I don't think will be a recipe for success as we go into the future. So. Hopefully with that, I've said enough things that you find interesting or provocative or both, and we can have a good discussion from that. Thank you very much.
So it's interesting that I think a lot of the things that came up in your discussion are coming to the fore in the election debates that are going on, or discussions at least. So I think there's hopefully some very interesting questions that you'll get maybe from that context. But certainly let me open it up, and anybody want to take a shot? Yes, sir. And please introduce yourself.
Yeah, Al Sweetser, Department of Homeland Security. I have two questions, but I'll only ask one in the interest of airtime, at least right now. So I'd like to take the mirror image of the great power competition question. When you look at the Brexit and the impact on our most reliable ally over the past 10 or 15 years and the implications for the future, it seems like in terms of global great power competition, there's not a lot of capable other parties on our team going forward. And I was wondering if you could speak to the implications of that for us as a great power, given that we're going to be kind of an army of one.
Yeah, I guess I'm not that I'm not that pessimistic about it, and presumably you don't want my thoughts on, or I give you my thoughts on Brexit, but and that's that the British voters spoke. I mean, that's democracy. They get to make those decisions. Look, I think that for some countries, the burden that they're going to have to bear is actually going to be an easier one than some of the things that they've been asked to do more recently. So if we just let me take an Asian example to begin with. For Japan, Chinese military modernization, growth of Chinese military might does pose a challenge. But if you look at what Japan needs to do to defend itself, actually it's a more comfortable, a more traditional, in many cases, set of missions than the things that we asked Japan to do and Japan agreed to do, say, in Iraq and in support of Afghanistan. And it is in that case, support defending the Japanese homeland. So that's actually in some ways an easier sell. I think for a number of NATO countries, that's also the case. And then I would also say, if I was just to line up, if I was choosing a softball team, or if I was choosing a whatever team, I don't know that I would trade any of our allies for anybody else. You have some of the most powerful, dynamic, innovative societies in the world. So, not to say that we shouldn't seek more from our allies, but I think oftentimes what experience has shown is that we need to do more in order for our allies to do more. That it's not if we do less, our allies are necessarily going to do more. They might do more, but they might do more, but not what we desire, or not what would be in the broader interest. So I think that's a very, my view of these things is, in general, we should proceed kind of along with our allies along three lines. One is what makes sense for the United States. I mean, if it doesn't make sense for the United States, it's not likely to be politically viable. What makes sense for our ally? Same thing. If it doesn't make sense for our ally to do in the absolute, it's probably not viable. But crucially, the third, which is what are those things that working together can have a disproportionate impact? And for me, it would be looking along those three lines for the things that we can do best with our allies.
Hi, I'm Monica Capra. I'm visiting staff. My question is regarding the role that economic and financial integration can play in reducing the military conflict.
Sure.
And in fact, it's more likely to happen when there isn't such integration. So one strategic approach to improve the relationships with Russia and China might be actually to push for more economic and financial integration.
Look, I'm willing to grant half of that. So I'm willing to grant that economic interdependence mitigates the possibility of conflict. But I don't think there's actually a strong case that it eliminates the possibility of conflict. And I mentioned World War I earlier. I mean, the European great powers were more economically interdependent in 1914 than kind of the great powers are today. And by and large, their royal families were related to one another to boot. None of that proved decisive. So just as a general proposition, I don't find it persuasive. Beyond that, I think even if I would grant you that, I think there are powerful trends on both sides that are arguing against greater economic interdependence. Whether you're talking about trends, say in the well, you could talk about the Russian economy, which is fundamentally a resource-based economy. The Chinese economy, and with a shift from export-led growth to consumption-based growth, that's likely to lead to less economic interdependence, or the U.S. economy, where there's increasing kind of dissatisfaction with economic interdependence, or technological developments such as additive manufacturing that'll just make it easier to do things closer to home. So even if I were to grant you that, I think the broad economic trends are actually taking us in a different direction.
David David Orden from Virginia Tech. Let me follow up on the last question and then ask a separate one if it doesn't take too long. So the first point is that, I mean, during the Cold War, one of the U.S. strategies was not economic integration with our adversaries in the Cold War, but economic integration of our team.
Yep.
And we seem to be substantially moving away from providing that leadership, which is to me a concern. Not necessarily further economic integration with China, because we seem to be at somewhat of economic odds with China in terms of negotiating our economic relationship, but in marshaling a world of integrated with the United States in opposition to China, or potentially to, as Russia collapsed, to potentially pull China further into integration.
Yeah.
So I'd be interested in your comments on that. And then if I can just follow with another separate question. There's risks of doing things and there's risks of not doing things. And so I'm trying to think about, one of the places where we seem to be having this proxy conflict is the Middle East. And it's, potentially could shape up even more as a major power conflict. So I'm trying to think what the next administration might do compared to what the Obama administration has done. I mean, it's easy to say that things haven't worked out as well as might have been hoped in the Obama draw back a little strategy. But, if you think of the next administration, I'd be curious what your views are. It seems to me there can be some are going to say, let's get more active. Are we going to go back to war? Put more troops in? Some are going to say, let's pull out more. And I have a feeling that no matter who the next administration is, after all that's considered, we're going to wobble around the path we're on now, but not move very far from it. I'd be interested in your
Sure. No, so to your first point, no, I agree with you, and actually, I think one of the more worrisome developments, for me is, basically walking away from TPP, for example, after a lot of effort to negotiate it, and the fact that neither of the presidential candidates support TPP at this point, and I think it is worrisome because. As I said in response to Al, I mean, we have a very strong team when it comes to our allies and our friends in the Asia Pacific region, and one of the key things that we can do is to better work with each other and support each other. So that I think, but unfortunately, there's substantial domestic opposition and maybe a deficit of political courage when it comes to moving forward on some of those things. Second, in terms, I think whoever's elected, whoever assumes power January 20th of next year, is going to face the opportunity and probably also the need to recalibrate perceptions of the United States, particularly among those who wish us ill. I'll just say that. I mean, to include not just great powers but others. And I think so. There'll be a need to show that there's new leadership in Washington, and so that may extend to. I think it probably should extend to actually taking moves that are riskier than we have recently, because we've allowed kind of our ability to deter to erode. I would say, I would say this is less the case in the Middle East, and I think, but more the case, say, in Eastern Europe. At the very least, what the next administration can do is be more forthcoming in giving, in the case of Eastern Europe, it's actually allies, supplying them the capabilities that they need to defend themselves, or other sovereign governments like the government of Ukraine giving them more of the means to defend themselves. That's different than Americans fighting for Ukraine. But as long as they're Ukrainians who want to fight for Ukraine, why not give them the ability to do that? So that would be a difference than the current policy. And then I think just working more closely with our allies, with whom we share not only common interests but common values. So yeah, those are some kind of generic things that I would think about.
My name's Joel Peters. I'm the chair of the Government International Affairs Program at Virginia Tech. I've got a three-part question which goes slightly against the grain of the flow of your presentation. The first is, you said we don't use the word great power competition.
Yeah, no, I said the White House reportedly told the Defense Department not to use it.
So the question is, why is that? Is that naivety, or is there a reason? But really, there was a slightly deterministic overview of your presentation, that somehow conflict is inevitable, it's coming, we need to be ready. So my question is, so what is this competition about? What are the aims or the purpose of our competitors? And really, beyond China and Russia, are there other great powers, or is this really about US, Russian, Chinese competition? Or is it a broader conflictual world in which other powers will be in conflict with each other as well, to which the US may get drawn into? Thank you.
Those all the parts? Okay. No. So first, I'll take the blame for not more explicitly defining my terminology. So competition is not the same thing as conflict, right? So if you'd picture a spectrum or a line where one endpoint is cooperation and the other is conflict, competition is somewhere in the middle. And I purposely separated my discussion about what a hypothetical future great power war would look like in the 21st century from what great power competition may look like. And no, it's not. I mean, it's not deterministic. There's no determinism in saying on the one hand that there's great power competition. It's not. That doesn't mean that it'll go to war, or it doesn't also mean necessarily that it won't be ended amicably. I mean, the United States in the mid to late 19th century into the early 20th century, we had a competition with a then dominant great power, Great Britain, and that ended amicably. I think not the least because we were both democracies, or constitutional monarchy and a democracy. And so to say that there's a competition is not to prejudge its outcome. So that's why. Why the White House says don't use great power competition, I'm probably the least qualified person to answer that. When it comes to the broader kind of strategic environment, look, I do think that first off, Russia and China pose different challenges, unique challenges. Again, one is a waning power. Look at Russia's demographic situation. Look at Russia's economic situation. The future isn't bright, and I think, and because of that, in the near term, it's probably the kind of the more the nastier challenge. China, I think, has the greater kind of long-term gravitational pull to affect the international system, and China could evolve a lot of different ways, economically, politically, but I think that's the more consequential one in the mid to long term. But also then there's the issue of how you think about Russo-American relations, right? Because you can think of a number of different combinations there as well. So each is unique, but I think there's also a basket that has to do with China, Russia, and the United States. There are certainly regional challenges as well. I mean, there are, again, it's my terminology, not anybody else's, but I mean, you talk about regional rogue states, whether it's North Korea, Iran, and then there's the enduring challenge of Islamist radicalism. But I think I focused on great power competition simply because it's a topic that hasn't received the type of in-depth attention that it deserves. And when one starts to think about that, then one realizes all sorts of, again, ways that we need to think about things and areas that we need to explore that we've just have grown unused to doing in recent years.
Okay, maybe we'll take one or two more. Sally, did you? And then we'll come
Sure.
back here. And then we'll...
I'm Sally Keller. I'm the director of the Social and Decision Analytics Lab here at Virginia Tech. And I'm colored a little bit by the fact that we're in the throes of searching for a new engineering dean. So I've sat through 2 days of interviews, and I've heard, great.
We probably weren't talking about this.
No, but I've heard some, great engineering leaders give their vision of the future and how that affects the education that we do. And so the topics that come up are topics of globalization, global food supply, water, more in the context of how is it going to be safe for the food supply, changes in education, particularly in this country, changes in how education might be affected by different political decisions. So when I think about that, and I think about what you've had to say, what should we be teaching our students? How should we be talking to our students to get their engagement in some of the issues that you've raised?
Well, how long do I have to answer? I mean, look.
According to the interviews, 50 minutes.
So yeah, I'm not interested in the job, but thank you. Although, my in-laws, all of whom are engineers, would probably think better of me because of it. But no, look. So let me start with the point about globalization. I think that reflects it reflects reality, or the reality that we've experienced. But it also reflects American hopes and values and desires, right? That kind of marching into the future, and we'll all benefit, and we'll all be more and more interconnected. And I think that's a very happy future. But I think whether it's China in its way, or Russia in its way, or even Iran in its way, you have powers that don't buy into that vision, that buy into a very different vision, and are really trying to segregate and segment the world, and to insulate themselves from those forces. And so, we may, the U.S. government may, repeat constantly, we don't seek to overthrow the Chinese Communist Party, we don't seek to overthrow the Russian government. They don't believe it. And in fact, why should they? And then I'm saying, again, I'm not saying that there is any conspiracy or plot, but rather it's those forces of globalization and the forces of Western culture and Western ideas are caustic to authoritarian regimes. So we should understand that as well, and we shouldn't comfort ourselves in the fact, and we shouldn't lull ourselves into believing that just because these are desirable and that others will consider that they're desirable as well. I think one of the most important things that an education can provide is not just facts and knowledge, but also empathy and an awareness that others and you can think about others in many different ways. But so we're talking about international relations, we're talking about security, I mean, that others view the world just fundamentally different than we do. And we can wish it were otherwise. Again, it's a very Western view that we, just through argumentation and discussion, we can resolve our differences. I just don't believe it. I mean, and I think an understanding and appreciation of that really is fundamental. Just a last response would be to indulge in an anecdote, but I think it's a telling one, which is the very first public speaking, well, semi-public, it was at Harvard, talk that I gave after leaving the Defense Department in 2009 was at Harvard. It was part of the Russian Generals Program that the Kennedy School puts on. And so imagine a lecture hall maybe 5 times the size and precisely half U.S. military officers, half Russian officers. It was in January or maybe early February 2009. So the Georgia War had been the previous August, and I was up after Ambassador Kislyak, the Russian ambassador to the United States, still the Russian ambassador to the United States, who is just out of central casting. I mean, he almost appeared in black and white. He almost was like he wasn't in full color. He was kind of in black and white, kind of Khrushchevite. And, he went and gave this whole speech that either was propaganda or delusional or was really genuinely the way he saw the world. And I actually think it was the latter. And then, I gave my talk, and then I entered into a discussion with the students. And after about 5 or 10 minutes, it became apparent that there were just some topics, including the Georgia War, that we just couldn't discuss. And I had to say, look, we can't discuss this, because a discussion is predicated on a shared set of facts. Maybe some of those facts are contested, but there's a shared set of facts. And we just don't have a shared set of facts on this. The Russians had this set of facts, the Americans had this set of facts. And I just had to call an end to it. And that was kind of against my better judgment as an educator, right? Because again, we believe that, again, we can reason through these things. But it was completely fruitless. Because at least as far as Georgia was concerned, they were just in an alternate reality. So.
One more, Ken, and then after this, we're gonna go to the reception, so there'll be more opportunity to hopefully continue to discuss with Tom.
All right, then. I hope this isn't too big. My name's Ken Schmid, and I'm asking this as my capacity as a student, so I don't get into trouble. I hope this isn't too big.
I get to grade you, or what?
Yeah, please. So after,
right.
But after at the reception. I'm thinking about, there's a great bit of analysis here. I'm trying to get at what worries you in your analysis and your assumptions. And you've used it, basically your thesis is the future is going to be much like the past, and you're using kind of historic analogies to get us there, right? And human cognitive biases being what they are, you're looking at similarities and tracing them forward. I'm wondering, what about the differences? What about the key differences? Sure. And which of those worry you most? Because you clearly came down on the side that the future is going to be much like the past. So I'm thinking there are differences right now. And the lady that asked the question, the first one, one of the key differences being global capitalism and our integrated economies now. The other things I'm thinking of are social media, the connectivity, and these sort of things. Yep.
So if I gave you the impression that the future is going to be just like the past, then I failed. Because the future will, again, great power, and if I just, not the future, but if I focus on great power competition, look, in some ways it'll look like the past, in some ways it'll be quite different. And I was hoping in my discussion of issues such as mobilization and so forth to say that the overall concept may be valid, but it's going to look a lot different in the future. However, when it comes to facts, the only place to find facts is in history, right? The future hasn't happened. The past has happened. So I wouldn't ignore the past. But I would say, no, look, the future's, many of these, as you say, there are many differences. Just as there are many lessons to be learned from the past, there are also probably some past lessons that we shouldn't learn. And there are likely to be things that are different as well. I think what concerns me, to get to the beginning of your question, is that this is just an area that we have not thought about in many dimensions for a quarter of a century. And so for those in the college education part of it, students and look, I teach grad school, so my average age of my students, incoming age is sort of 26, 27, but it's equally true for them. This is totally beyond their experience. And even when I was teaching officers, it was including officers, a number of whom joined during the Cold War and presumably because of it, in some ways, it was beyond their experience as well in a lot of ways. So yeah, I mean, if I leave all of you with the impression that I think the future is going to be just a replay of the past, that's not true. But I do think that there are things that can be learned from the past. And if nothing else, it is worth going back, as I concluded, and sort of doing an audit and saying, well, what were the capabilities, what were the things that we thought about in the past, and where do we stand now? Not to say that that's the complete list or an exhaustive list or the list, but that's a place to start. If we don't do that, and if we don't pay attention to the past, then we'll just be perpetually surprised. And I'll end with one last anecdote, but it's on this theme, which is, I can't tell you the number of times I've heard in the case of Russia, hybrid war, the Gerasimov doctrine, all these new things. My question back is, how much of any of this is genuinely new? And my overall belief is very little of it is actually new. Meaning what the Russians are doing is in many cases, what the Soviets would have done given the same circumstances. That there's been less change and more our inattention to events. That because we've gotten out of the business of thinking in these terms, now we display cat-like attention. Here's a fuzzy ball, here's some catnip. We go back and forth, but we've lost our focus, and because of it, things that maybe aren't novel seem novel. And so, if I would leave you with a thought on the value of history, it allows you to identify what is genuinely novel compared to what just seems novel because we haven't studied it. Thanks.
Let's thank Tom one more time. So I have a parting gift for you. And it just occurs to me that Tom very smartly wore an orange tie, Virginia Tech colors. Did you plan that?
My wife, the UVA graduate, she would say something about orange.
It's UVA orange. Well, we're going to take credit for it. So yeah. So here you go.
Thank you very much.
It's very small. I really appreciate you coming out, and this was fantastic. Please, everyone, join us in the reception for I think we go till maybe a little bit after 6 at least, and there's opportunities to have some more face-to-face discussion with Tom. I hope you'll be able to stick around.
Absolutely.
All right. Thanks, everyone, again.